the session and we are going live now. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ed Bristois. I am the Director for International Trade at the American Chemistry Council, but this week I'm wearing a different hat. I'm here on this panel with the International Council of Chemical Associations, which is a global super association of chemical associations. And we are presenting today chemicals as a catalyst for WTO modernization. Recently, the ICCA launched a significant paper, a consensus paper across all of our diverse members from different regions of the world, from Latin America, Africa, Asia, the Gulf. And this paper is a set of recommendations on how to modernize the WTO from a chemical industry perspective. So what we want to do today with the panel is to help you understand what those recommendations are from the very diverse perspectives that I just outlined. We've got a great panel for you. I'll introduce the speakers. The bios should be on the WTO website for the public forum. But I'm going to start with Lisa Schroeder. She's the Global Director for Trade and Investment at Dow Chemical, Dow Inc. these days. And Lisa is a longstanding champion of trade, women in trade, and she has such deep knowledge about trade agreements and trade negotiations. And we're absolutely thrilled she's here on the panel. She's the chair of our ICCA Trade Policy Network Group as well. So she's been leading the charge on trying to get this paper done and published. And that paper's on the ICCA website as well if you're interested, iccachem.org. I'm next going to introduce Udit Arora. Udit comes to us from the Gulf Petrochemical and Chemical Association. And Udit is one of our strongest contributors in our Trade Policy Network Group. Provided a lot of content to what we were doing to draft the paper. And what GPCA has done is translated that paper into Arabic and shared it with all the Gulf governments. And Udit can describe how they've engaged in the Gulf and on the issues in our paper on WTO modernization. Next is Catherine Grant Macaquer. Catherine is an international trade expert residing in South Africa. She formerly was a trade negotiator with the New Zealand government. She represents the South African chemical industry on international trade issues. And so she's got deep knowledge of trade in Africa, and that's the perspective she's bringing here today. And then next to me, I don't think they can see you, Alejandra. Yeah, so you might have to move. Alejandra Acosta is a consultant to the ICCA, and she is a regulatory expert. She formerly served in the Argentine government and working on chemical management issues. And now she is a consultant with ICCA to work on international regulatory cooperation in Latin America. And so she's going to talk about why regulatory cooperation is a really important step for the WTO to take in the future to prevent barriers to trade. So with the introductions out of the way, I would like to turn to a few questions. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask questions of the panelists, and they're going to provide some perspectives. And then I think with about 15 minutes left, we are going to shift gears and do audience Q&A. So the first question I have is for Lisa. Lisa, why is this important at all? Why is a global industry like the chemicals industry coming together around a set of priorities for WTO modernization an important step forward?
Ed, thanks so much for the question, and thanks so much for putting this together. And I'm going to echo a number of things that you heard in the introduction to this paper. We are really excited about the opportunity to offer not only what we consider to be some really practical and pragmatic recommendations, but some great thought starters. This is a fantastic way of really reigniting the conversation around what WTO modernization needs to look like, but how it's really grounded in the global economic recovery we're all focused on, especially as we come out of the challenging times for the last 2 years. In particular, I think our paper represents a really strong set of recommendations because of the diversity of inclusion. And not just the great gender diversity that we have on this panel, but the fact that this is really a geographically diverse group, sectors of our industry, from, as Ed was saying, Latin America, from Africa, from the Gulf, from Asia Pacific. That's our industry at all levels of development, but coming together in a couple of really consistent messages. And one, the most important and overwhelming, is support for the WTO. The fact that our members spent almost a year working out what these ideas and recommendations needed to be, really putting resources behind developing a truly consensus set of perspectives that would represent our industry at all levels, but also really highlight the role our industry plays in driving real economic development and investment. After all, chemicals are a necessary over 96% of the needs. So we see the rules looking so that competitive environment is really important. Not just large companies like represented by Dow, but that represents a lot of small players to developing industry economies that really make a difference. And the fact that we were able to bring together not only on the process reforms, how WTO organization can function better, but think ahead to what would be a more creative agenda. How do we align with the innovation that our industry is driving, especially in the sustainability space, to make a real difference and to set rules where we can bring these innovations to life in the global economy? That was it. It was the exciting thing about the process of this paper. And now that we're launched, we're eager to use this, as we are with this session, to really reach out to the broader community, policymakers, our home capitals, our friends in Geneva, but across the industry sectors to drive this conversation on how we can really make a difference and how we can help work with the WTO in their leadership role to build a multilateral trade environment where we can get back to doing real business. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Really appreciate those perspectives. We'll dig into them further as we move along through the panel, but I want to turn to Udit next. And Udit, why did the Gulf Petrochemical and Chemical Association members come out to support WTO modernization? What's in it for them?
Ed, firstly, thank you for having me here today, and I feel privileged to join this panel of esteemed experts from around the world. And I would like to commence by emphasizing the importance of our chemical industry, which is quite often overlooked, And I think Lisa already mentioned that we contribute close to 96% of all manufacturing activities. We are supporting sustainable development around the world. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic, though devastating, has demonstrated the importance of our industry as a solution provider to global challenges. In this time of unprecedented crisis, the chemical industry has demonstrated its resilience and stepped up to cater to the needs of frontline workers and other essential services in the fight against the pandemic. And the agri-nutrients industry as well. They played a commendable role to ensure food security during the pandemic through uninterrupted production and supply of essential agri-nutrients. Now, as we are emerging from the pandemic, we at GPCA, our members, strongly believe that now is the time for a modernized WTO with a new trade negotiation agenda and necessary reforms within the key functions of the WTO. These include, but not limited to, of course, enabling the free flow of trade through the elimination of both tariff and non-tariff barriers. Now, the GCC chemical industry, we export to over 100 countries, but we are experiencing a rising trend where WTO members are imposing trade protectionist measures, often under the pretext of protecting their local industries and economies. Nevertheless, often these imposed measures are unjustified and not aligned with the rules of the WTO, and in many cases, they're not even notified to the relevant WTO committees before implementation. As a result, our member companies are facing trade restrictive barriers and disruptions like never before. And I would like to emphasize that such measures have the potential to severely disrupt the flow of trade and create bottlenecks, thereby affecting the entire value chain in the process. In order to overcome such barriers, it is crucial to not only fully implement the WTO TBT agreement to ensure that technical regulations and standards do not create unnecessary obstacles to trade, but also trade-related measures should be made more transparent. So relevant members are notified sufficiently in advance and are given the opportunity to provide their feedback to prevent such trade disruptions from taking place. Next, I would like to highlight another key area which should not be overlooked in the process of reformation of the WTO, and that is of greater regulatory cooperation on the management of chemical substances. Promotion and collaboration on the implementation of international standards, for instance, can have several benefits. It promotes regulatory efficiency, facilitates trade, eases compliance procedures, reduces costs, and importantly, encourages the safe transport, handling, and use of chemicals. Enhanced regulatory cooperation would not just prevent barriers to trade, but also help restore the WTO's multilateral rules-making mandate. Therefore, to diminish such trade restrictive measures and to build resilient supply chains, a reformed WTO is crucial to ensure that trade flows as smoothly, predictably, and freely as possible. And we also look forward to partnering with our peers to achieve the same. So in a nutshell, that's the reasons we are supporting this cause. Back to you, Ed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Udit. I really appreciate that and all the effort you put into getting this paper published and out into the WTO world. I just do want to make one housekeeping comment that I should have made earlier. For those brave souls who are in the room right now, if you do want to ask questions, in order for the interpretation to work, you would have to do it through the Zoom, the platform itself. So right now, you're not connected if you use the microphone here. So you'd have to go through the platform if you have a laptop or tablet. Okay, so let's turn now to Catherine. Catherine, like I said, you're representing the South African chemical industry. What are the benefits to your industry in South Africa for WTO modernization?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Ed, and thanks for having me here today. I think at the heart of the ICCA paper, as Lisa explained, is very much a commitment to multilateralism. And multilateralism, I think, is much more important these days, particularly for developing and smaller economies. And when we talk about the industries in countries like South Africa and the rest of the African continent, we have to take into account the fact that they are smaller players and that certainly there is a need for those global rules to be very strong in order to protect developing countries who do not necessarily have the economic power of others. And the other aspect of the ICCA paper that I want to highlight in responding to that question about its importance for a country like South Africa is the emphasis that we've placed on trade playing a very important role for economic growth and sustainable development. Certainly the Chemicals and Allied Industry Association of South Africa firmly believes that if we can grow exports and if we can enhance our participation in global supply chains, then we will be able to make a contribution positively to the inclusive economic growth, as well as the economic recovery, as Udit said, of countries like South Africa following the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that exporting and importing firms provide more jobs, including for women, and so that participation in international trade is a really crucial aspect of our ongoing development agenda. The ICCA recommendations that are in the paper that I'd like to briefly mention at this point are the ones that also talk to leveling the global playing field, including from our suggestions about new rules on subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and so on. And we believe that that's a really critical aspect too that is important from the point of view of a country like South Africa and an industry like ours. We believe it would certainly support the development and the participation in trade of smaller chemicals firms from places like South Africa and the rest of the continent. And so we're very much behind those recommendations to level the playing field through an ongoing commitment to multilateralism. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to turn to Alejandra next. So Alejandra, you have a regulatory background. You're now in the private sector. You're a consultant for ICCA. But can you tell us about the experience of Latin American chemical regulators and the industry that you work with and how that's informed WTO modernization discussions?
Sure, Ed, and thank you for having me here. It's a great honor. So, as you said, coming from Argentina particularly, but from Latin America, having a background as a regulator, I can say that certainly what's there in the paper is really useful in terms of recommendations for WTO modernization. So, just to provide a little bit of background, in Latin America, we are currently going through a huge transformation when it comes to chemical regulations. We see a lot of developing economies that start putting in place regulations that used to be only in developed economies. And what we have seen is that so far, there has been no coordination approach, not coordinated approach between countries. And this tends to end up generating conflicting regulations between trade partners and of course, generating trade barriers. So another characteristic that we have in Latin America is that usually governments, regulators, industries usually do not have the resources to actually develop regulations. They don't have the technical skills. So there is a huge need for capacity building. And based on these two aspects, ICCA started a project in which we are providing assistance to the local industry associations. There is a forum established that is called LARC that joins all the different local associations, industry chemical associations, and we are assisting them through different approaches. One of them, we are having webinars in which we bring together different experts, international experts, regional experts from different audiences, and we discuss chemical regulations. We start focusing on creating regulatory cooperation. And what does this mean? This means that we are looking for an exercise of establishing intelligent regulations that look at what has been done in other economies, but adapt those regulations to the local situations without copy pasting them, but also without expending resources that could be optimized through these mechanisms. Also, we have established a virtual working group with actually more than 13 economies of the region are represented. More than 50 participants meet every 45 days. We work in designing the framework of model regulations that then can be used by countries, in which we look to have these synergies in terms of efforts. So this is a great example that WTO can build on. We actually based our project in what the Asian Regulatory Cooperation Forum is also doing. So there is a huge example of regional activities that could actually be used at the international level at WTO. We really believe that regulatory cooperation is one of the best mechanisms to establish intelligent regulations, science-based regulations that can be effectively implemented by the different stakeholders, and that at the end can save scarce resources.
Thank you. Thank you, Alejandra. A great message. I'd love to focus on regulatory cooperation. It's really important for not just the chemical industry, but I think all industries to help shape regulation to protect human health, safety, and the environment. So I think it's something that ICCA obviously wants WTO to focus more on. I'm going to go back to Lisa, and we should probably dive into the recommendations of the paper a little bit more. But Lisa, can you tell us what are the priorities for global industry, for WTO institutional reform, or for new negotiations based on these recommendations?
Absolutely, Ed. And I'm going to pick up where Alejandra left off. And the great work that she was just describing about the Latin American Reg Co-op Forum, the similar work going on that Judith's been leading in the Gulf, as well as our ASEAN partners in Southeast Asia. It's a really good example of one recommendation process-wise that really threads through our paper, and that's the need for greater stakeholder engagement. there's a real opportunity, especially if we think of how fast economies and commercial transactions, commercial transition is happening these days. The opportunity for us to bring that level of technical expertise to the table and really be able to engage with WTO at all levels will be really crucial to driving this agenda going forward. So creating opportunities like around the key theme you're hearing from us in the regulatory cooperation space, it's a really good example of where we can bring that technical expertise to the table in a way that informs better policy. As Ed was saying, hitting high standards of health and human safety, while we're also ensuring efficient processes, sound science risk-based set of procedures that encourage greater commercial activity. So that's clearly one area where, and I know it's not just us, we've seen it in a lot of other papers, the ideas of really building in more of that institutional engagement, stakeholder dialogue into the process. That's going to be key, especially as we think about the WTO reforming the broader process itself. In many areas, like within the functioning of the various committees, helping to ensure, again, a role of business community can help support in so many countries, really ensuring that their governments, our national affiliations are living up to their responsibilities when it comes to WTO obligations, notifying draft measures, ensuring we can work together to prevent the kind of protectionist issues that Udit was describing before. These are all really key areas. Certainly we are, as with everyone, we very strongly support reform of the dispute settlement system as well, so that the WTO can restore its leadership and its role managing these disputes. But I think most importantly, as we think about reforming the structure of the WTO, how to modernize procedures, how to create that collective drive to ensure that things are functioning well, that's really key to it goes hand in hand with the ability to drive or restore a multilateral negotiating agenda, multilateral or plurilateral, but opportunities for us to bring real issues to the table and to focus on how we can share best practices, build the right enabling environment for a more sustainable future for us all. In many of those spaces, as we think about the negotiations, there's a number of areas where, particularly as we come out of COVID, we can get more creative. There's been a lot of talk about trade and the environment, for example. That's a great theme that threads through so many current activities of the WTO, ideas around an environmental goods agreement. Maybe there's ways to build that out more broadly than tariffs, but to focus on what are the environmental technologies, goods, and services that we want to be promoting or ensuring have access to key markets sooner rather than later. Those could very well be regulatory or other issues. Investment facilitation, how we're not only setting the stage for countries to have strong investment policies, but potentially creating preferences for more sustainable projects. So we're really looking at better long-term return on those investments. And a third I would want to mention would be the digital trade space. I know it's not expected to hear about digital trade coming from traditional chemical manufacturing, but like with all industries these days, everyone's going tech. And the opportunity to really engage and ensure that as our officials are negotiating digital trade provisions, that's inclusive not only of the internet and e-commerce side of the world, but how we're leveraging technology to better support our workforce, deliver better products, services, and expertise to customers, and build out our opportunity to source that 96% of all manufacturing Udit was mentioning before is really going to be key. We need to ensure that those rules are comprehensive of both tech and manufacturing companies. So a lot of areas to opportunity, and hopefully that generates some really good discussion from our paper. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I think we're hearing a theme of regionalism being a source of great ideas and activity and enthusiasm on trade. And the theme as well is that the WTO should, I think, be inspired by those regional activities. So in that vein, I'd like to turn to Catherine next and flip this a little bit. Do you think the recommendations, Catherine, have value beyond the WTO for regional trade initiatives, including in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement?
Yeah, very much so, Ed. I think there's an interesting two-way relationship, if you like, between regional agreements and the WTO. We know that many regional trade agreements draw heavily on existing WTO rules, and that's clearly indicated also in the framework that we've got for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So in addition to regionalism inspiring the WTO, I think that there is definitely the inspiration having come from the multilateral system to regional trade agreements as well. And that makes certainly the ICCA recommendations very relevant for an initiative like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We're excited about the AFCFTA on the continent. We think that it is really going to help many African countries leverage a much wider marketplace. And it also, I think, shows a strong political commitment right now to the ideals that the WTO, in fact, is also based upon. So there are three areas that I would want to touch upon from the ICCA paper that I think are particularly relevant for a regional arrangement like the AFCFTA. The first one Lisa just mentioned, actually, which was the digital trade, electronic commerce space, because the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is just moving into the phase of negotiating a protocol on electronic commerce. And so I think that the call that we've made as an industry for economically viable rules based on data privacy, cybersecurity, and that support also for manufacturers in terms of their use of technology, that they're quite useful principles to help guide the African negotiations on e-commerce under the AFCFTA. Another recommendation that I particularly like in the ICCA paper for a number of reasons is the one about enhancing stakeholder consultations and stakeholder engagement. I think that really is critical, not only in the WTO space, but certainly in the AFCFTA. It's something that the South African Chemical and Allied Industries Association has been working on very actively, and that is expanding our level of engagement with counterparts in other African countries, including through regional business councils and the newly formed continental level of business associations as well, because we really believe that engagement is what's going to make an agreement like the AFCFTA live up to its potential, is if you actually get the private sector much more actively involved in the process. And lastly, I'd like to also come back to that point of regulatory cooperation, which Alejandra very eloquently spoke about in terms of the context of Latin America. And it's equally as relevant in our minds for African countries as well. There's a lot to be done in terms of encouraging and promoting international standards in the African context, as well as trying to build up those regional regulatory cooperation networks. And so those are just three areas that I can point to in the ICCA recommendations. But the short answer is I think that these ideas are very important from a regional perspective, just as they are at a multilateral level as well. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks so much, Catherine. And I think we should stay on that theme of regulatory cooperation for a moment. I'm going to turn again to Alejandra. Why should the WTO care about regulatory cooperation, and what can the WTO do to support regulatory cooperation activities that are happening regionally, bilaterally, et cetera?
Well, thank you for that question. And certainly, I know we have several experiences that show that when you make regulations without involving regulators, actually that's not the best way forward. You usually don't get the results that you are expecting, and that's some way how WTO has been working at a point at this moment. So there is no formal processes for having a stakeholder involvement in the discussions and in the preparations of WTO decisions. And this is something that WTO, I think, can do from now on, recognizing that regulatory cooperation is one of the best ways to achieve intelligent, smart, science-based regulations. From my experience at Latin America, when you do not have the environmental regulations that you need, or when you have regulations, but they have been designed by the environmental people and you end up having conflicting regulations along the region, what you end up creating is a very difficult system to actually be implemented. You get quite a lot of trade barriers, and you definitely do not have an enforcement system robust enough to ensure that you are achieving the results that you were expecting. So from my perspective, I think WTO has an excellent opportunity to promote regulatory cooperations, and there are different mechanisms that can be implemented. What we can ensure is that if you do regulations in which you involve all stakeholders, you follow the best regulatory practices that have been promoted by several agencies, OECD, etc., then you achieve the highest levels of protection for human health, for environment, establishing science and risk-based approaches, and reducing trade barriers. And this is something that I think it's a win-win situation for all. So from my perspective, there are several things that WTO could focus on. For example, there should be a promotion of the implementation of GHS, of the globally harmonized system for classification and labeling of chemicals. This is crucial for enhancing human health protection, for protecting the environment, by providing an already international, standardized, comprehensive system for hazard classification and labeling of chemicals. Also, I think there is a huge opportunity of promoting OECD mutual acceptance of data, the MAD system. This is an excellent system for reducing the sharing efforts of information while also promoting alternative test methods to animal testing. We need to optimize the use of resources from the private sector, from the public sector. We have to focus in the implementation of these regulations by developing economies, by SMEs, and these kind of regulations actually facilitate the work that needs to be done. So recognizing international activities, sharing data, avoiding the duplication of the generation of data, which is really costly, adapting the studies and focusing the resources for adapting those studies to the local situation, to the local circumstances. These are all necessary steps for streamlining, for accelerating the development of national public policies. So I think there is a lot to be done, and I hope all stakeholders, particularly regulated stakeholders, can be involved in the design of future elements that WTO is working on.
Thank you, Alejandra. So another theme we're picking up here is that it's important for industry and government to talk to one another. And I think ICCA so far, we're trying to talk to the WTO members, the governments, in a variety of contexts locally. For example, each ICCA member is sharing this paper on WTO modernization with their own governments. We're here this week doing meetings with various WTO members and telling them about our perspectives on WTO modernization. So I'm going to turn to Udit then, because I think the GPCA, the Gulf Petrochemical and Chemical Association, has actually led the charge here with some early outreach to the Gulf governments. So Udit, can you tell us more about how the Gulf governments have worked, or GPCA has worked with the Gulf governments on WTO modernization, and which of the ICCA recommendations in the paper are gaining traction right now?
This is an important question, and thank you for asking. At the GPCA, we monitor international trade practices and trade policy, including regulatory measures that affect our members' access to global markets. We actually actively and regularly advocate for the removal of tariff and non-tariff trade barriers in compliance with the WTO rules and principles, and we promote cooperation on policies that improve the trade flow of our regional industries, products to export markets. In regards to modernizing the WTO, we at GPCA have launched, as you had alluded to earlier, on the 12th of April of this year, a bilingual position paper reflecting our regional industry's position, which is broadly aligned with the recommendations and principles set forth in the ICCA's position paper that you're launching. We have shared this position paper with the concerned regulatory authorities in the region, and we have been in continuous dialogue with them after sharing this. And we're stressing to them the importance of their engagement in the WTO reform proceedings through active participation and engagement within the relevant councils and committees of the WTO. Thereby, they are able to protect the trade of our regional chemical industry and ensure its sustainable growth, something, as you rightly mentioned, is becoming a developing theme, and has been alluded to by my esteemed colleagues on this panel. Now, the response that we have received so far has been very, very positive for us and extremely encouraging. We have also actively engaged with the regional media, to highlight the regional industry's position on the matter. So the message is loud and clear to the wider audience within the region. In terms of which recommendations are gaining traction, I would say that there's a wide consensus that it's time to set a clear vision to reform the WTO and restore confidence and certainty to the international trading environment. This is proving to be a challenging task, but we believe it is not only the need of the hour, but it is also doable. I think some of the recommendations I will put forth now have been already discussed by my colleagues, but I'm going to reinforce them. The ICCA recommendation that is gaining the most traction amongst our members is to fix the WTO dispute settlement understanding. As currently the rules are outdated and not in sync with the global economic, political, and technical developments. In addition, with the steadily increasing number of members of the WTO, it is currently almost impossible to achieve negotiations between member states. A necessary first step should hence be for all the members to agree on the necessary reforms to allow the affiliate or body to function at full capacity as soon as possible. I think this is the main priority for us right now. Along with this, we also believe that an uninterrupted cross-border supply chain trade agreements will play a crucial role here. And in particular, the multilateral trade agreements, again alluded to by Lisa earlier. As I mentioned earlier, fostering great regulatory cooperation, and this is another point already addressed by my colleagues, the cooperation both at the regional and global level is of utmost importance to attain this. In our region, we are starting to see an increase in cooperation between the chemical industry and regulators on various trade-related matters, and such partnerships are reaping fruitful results for both parties. To end here, in another key element which is gaining traction amongst our members and the regulators is to implement the digital trade process. Again, Lisa alluded to this. Digital trade based on the free flow of data across borders is critical to our chemical manufacturers. And for the region, this is specifically a pressing issue in the area of customs compliance and cross-border trade. Customs authority in our region still require physical documents, during cross-border trade crossings, and this is causing significant delays in intra-GCC trade activities. Hence, we're currently working with the concerned authorities to support them and to promote the implementation of digital trade processes for regulatory compliance. In closing, I would like to also highlight the ICCA's recommendation on creating a negotiating agenda to support sustainability. Our industry realizes that this is a vital role in providing solutions to the global environmental challenges. Our member companies are setting, carbon neutrality targets to further support the global goals on carbon neutrality by 2050. I believe Lisa mentioned about trade and environment a little while ago. And here I would like to take the example of our colleagues in the region, SABIC, who have set a target to reduce the intensity of its energy and GHG emissions by 25% by 2025, so another 4 years from 2010 levels. Several other companies in the region are also in the process of redefining the business strategies, with sustainability being at the core of the transformation. I think we can all agree there's no escaping this today. And we at GPCA are also working closely with the regional regulatory authorities to promote and encourage the uptake of standards that support circular economy and sustainability principles. And also the GHS standard that Alejandra mentioned, it is something that we've been working with the regional regulators to build and develop for this region, bringing in a globally recognized best practice and standard to this region. So it is without a doubt that these steps will be hugely beneficial to our industry and will also help achieve global sustainability agendas and national visions, such as the SDGs that were set forth by the UN for 2030 achievement. So this is from my side, Ed. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Udit. Great engagement. I'm glad to hear that there's a lot of interest in our recommendations in the Gulf, and we will continue to come back to you on what's in the art of the possible amongst those recommendations going forward. And I think the next question I have is, I'm going back to Lisa. It's been a while since we've heard Lisa. So a lot of the talk here this week at the WTO is about the ministerial conference coming up in December, and whether we can make progress there, whether there can be concrete, tangible outcomes. So what do you think those opportunities are for progress at MC12 in relation to the ICCA recommendations? And furthermore, I mean, modernization is a long-term process at the WTO. How is ICCA going to engage at the WTO in 2022 from your perspective? And how could the WTO actually increase stakeholder engagement in that engagement going forward?
Well, thanks, Ed. That's a great question. It's a great setup, because I think it really reinforces a number of things that all of my friends here have raised on the panel. And when we start from where you ended there with that stakeholder engagement, there are a lot of models. There's certainly a lot, as industry, we're involved in a lot of different practices, whether it's, as Alejandro was mentioning at the OECD, there's a very long-standing tradition of business engagement through the BIAC. Our industry has been big supporters of the APEC process, where again, there's not only a strong structural way for industry to engage, but a lot of voluntary opportunities, even in our own industry, driving discussions around the chemical dialogue. As global industry representatives, we have a lot of opportunities to engage. As Udit was describing, the fantastic work GPCA has done to reach out, create relationships with local regulators, local policymakers, and especially in the capitals where decisions are being made and transmitted to what countries want to see happen in Geneva. We need to be part of that process throughout the entire structure, and we're committed to doing that. We certainly will continue to strongly engage not only with our local policymakers, but also our friends and colleagues across industry, where the more we can build in that broader consensus in terms of a real commercially meaningful agenda, the more we bring to the table that makes us part of the WTO process. Dr. Ngozi has been very clear that she sees a lot of opportunities to build in more of that stakeholder engagement. And while the WTO has always been good about being open, creating sessions like this public forum or the trade dialogues, creating more of a structural opportunity would be good for all of us going forward. We've certainly learned how to engage with one another, even when we're doing it across a Zoom platform. There's a lot of ways where we can bring the right expertise and creativity to the table to do it, as you're describing, which, getting back to the MC12 agenda, could help put some real tangible ideas on the table. We know there are a lot of things. We know there are a lot of sensitivities when it comes to many of these issues, but the fact is, especially engaging with industry is a great opportunity for us to ground the reality of change in what it'll mean on the ground. The fact that industry can bring forward ideas that'll demonstrate, if we are to do this, if we are to take up an agenda like trade and circular economy, we can show what are going to be the tangible benefits in terms of economic growth, job creation, and genuinely better, healthier communities. I think us being able to contribute and show the consequences, the opportunities that are at stake, should help to drive a much more concrete agenda. And that's where, as our governments come together, and we would have that hope that MC12 especially is that recommitment to the process, for every government to do, meet their obligations, particularly being actively part of the process, so that we can really restore, re-energize activity at the WTO, but build that mandate going forward. I think the fact that we could create opportunities to do that together, as we've done today, bringing together this community for the conversation, is the real opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. So we've got a lot of work to do in the future, which is good. And I think coming back to the WTO at the ministerial conference is really important for all stakeholders, and being at the WTO next year equally important as the post MC12 agenda unfolds. So I want to invite the audience now to submit questions through the WTO all-in-one platform. We do have one question already in the queue that I will turn to in a moment, but I just want to go back to Catherine and ask about the role that the African industry, the Pan-African industry, can play to support modernization at the WTO, and how that can be aligned with the vision of the new Director General, Dr. Ngozi.
That's a really good point, Ed, about the Pan-African industry, because I think that before we can actually support the WTO, there is quite a lot that still needs to be done on an industry side in the African context. We're starting to engage much more at a Pan-African level, as I mentioned earlier. And we see the benefits coming through from that engagement in addressing collective concerns, including both at a continental level as well as at the global level around things like WTO modernization. So building up that capacity is something that I think is on the responsibility side of the industry. But certainly we've seen the new Director General, bringing into the WTO a really strong emphasis, I would say, on a willingness to listen to the concerns of developing countries in particular, which is critical, I think, to the success of any of these initiatives that we've been speaking about today. We all understand that the WTO has got a majority of members that come from developing economies, and therefore it's really important, I think, to be able to bring in their concerns, their interests when reforming the organization and taking forward the key agenda points. I think something that's really resonated this week in the sessions I've been listening to in the public forum, and it was something that came out from the Director General even earlier this year, and that is the really important focus on issues related to sustainability and climate change, and how they will need to be brought into the future of the WTO, as has already been said by Udit and others. I think that Dr. Okonjo-Iweala's vision on trade and environment has been quite clearly put forward. She very much makes the linkages between trade rules that can become greener, cleaner, and more inclusive. And those are all things that I think we are trying to talk to as well in the ICCA recommendations around sustainability and sustainable development. So as an industry, we're excited by that focus. We're excited by the opportunities for creative dialogue, as Lisa just pointed out. So I think we've got responsibility, as I say, on the part of the industry itself to make sure that we have the capacity to engage, including from the African perspective, but we're very much looking forward to taking some of these points forward as modernization of the WTO begins to happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. Really appreciate those perspectives. I think more industry engagement from diverse parts of the world here at the WTO is quite important. I think the digital world in which we exist now is a great example of how you can connect with so many people in Africa and Latin America and Asia to bring those voices to the WTO, and hopefully we can do more of that next year. We do have two questions actually from the audience members, virtually anyway, and I'm going to read the first question, and maybe I'll direct this to Alejandra, since she's sitting next to me. Have our proposal or recommendations received support from the WTO Director General? or others at the WTO at this point?
Well, thank you, and I must say that definitely, which is really exciting. We have been here with Ed. We have been having a lot of meetings with different members, different stakeholders, and actually there was extremely very well receptions to the paper, to the recommendations. I think that the common feeling here in Geneva is that there is this need for WTO to reform, to modernize, and there is an understanding or acceptance that to do this, we have to work together, we have to dialogue, we have to do what it takes to understand the position of others, to recognize that these are very complex issues. Trade is difficult, supply chain is even more difficult, chemicals are complex, so we really need to work together to hear the voices of every part of the chain, of every stakeholders in order to design better solutions. So I can say that we have heard a lot of support in the way forward to further engage from stakeholders. In general, the different proposals that the ICCA put forward in the paper were very well received. And we hope to see that there is a work plan in the next ministerial conference that actually addresses some, why not, all of these measures.
Thanks, Alejandra. Would any other panelists like to build on that?
Actually, Ed, I think that's a great tie-in to maybe you'd like to build on that, especially as part of Dr. Ngozi's visit to Washington last week.
Well, thank you for the question, Lisa. Yeah, so we had the opportunity to meet with Dr. Ngozi last week during her meetings in Washington, D.C., and she acknowledged the paper. She said she was grateful for it. It's a great initiative. So I think there is an awareness of the paper among the deputy director generals as well and other WTO secretariat staff. But that's not enough. We have to, as a super association, if you will, we have to make sure that this paper gets to the right audiences across the world, not just here in Geneva, but in local jurisdictions, in a variety of regions, both in developed countries and developing countries. So we have more homework to do for sure, but it's a great starting point. I do think overall we've had good reception for the concrete and practical ideas that we as an industry, a global industry, have suggested on WTO reform, particularly the institutional reform elements, which I think are the most practical out of everything. And you could really do a lot in the short term to address some of those issues.
Great points. And to borrow our title for this session, we really saw this paper as a catalyst. The idea was we recognize that this is a long-term discussion, and the ideas we put out in the paper, we have every expectation to continue to engage, to drive these conversations, both with industry colleagues as well as policymakers at home and in Geneva, so that we can continue to evolve these, get the best of these ideas. It sort of mirrors what we're talking about when we refer to stakeholder consultation. These are not one and done opportunities. We need to engage in the conversation, keep driving these so that we get the best of these recommendations and really bring everybody together to what is, Ed, as you were just saying, that practical, pragmatic agenda.
Absolutely, Lisa. We've got one other question I want to get to from an audience member. Are there things that other institutions, for example, APEC or OECD, could be doing to help the use of the chemical sector as a catalyst for WTO modernization? That's a really interesting question, because these other organizations are incubators of ideas that could be taken up in the WTO. So would other panelists like to comment there?
Well, I think that really reinforces what we're talking about on the regulatory cooperation front. And it's really about connecting all of the dots. We've had with the progress in the APEC chemical dialogue, we've had a long-standing relationship there, not just both with the regulators, but also with the trade ministries and the economic ministries who really see, you kind of understand that broader agenda of how regulatory can drive national economic development. So, as we look at that in APEC, it sort of mirrors what Alejandra was describing in terms of the industry's activities around regulatory cooperation forums. The idea of bringing together the private sector with the regulators and those driving our economic agendas to create a more efficient system that meets everybody's goals, high standards of health and human safety while supporting sound science, risk-based, efficient set of procedures that let all of us contribute to our economies and value chains, small business and large business alike. These are going to be critical opportunities. And I think the lessons learned from how they've worked in places like the regulatory cooperation forums at APEC and others could really be models, particularly in terms of how the WTO can take up these best practices and really build capacity, as Catherine was saying, tying that back into what we see as being some really innovative and potentially incredibly beneficial regional activities like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement.
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, I totally agree. Working through these regional organizations, I think there's a bigger list than just, frankly, APEC or OECD. There's a lot of regional organizations in Africa and Latin America that could also be good incubators of ideas. It's so important for the WTO to take up those ideas going forward as it moves through the reform agenda. But we're getting to the end of our time here, so I think we should go to the closing thoughts because I don't see any more questions from the audience. This is your last chance, audience, by the way. So let's do quick closing thoughts from our panelists. I'm going to start with Udit.
Thank you, Ed. I think I would like to close once again by suggesting that stressing on the importance of the sustainability agenda and how it applies to the reform of the WTO, and again stressing that the time is of the essence. Bad practices for trade are really not helping global movement of goods. I think that there's a time now, there's an opportunity now to start engaging with the businesses and the regulators coming together. I think it's for the benefit of everybody. So that would be my closing statement. Thank you, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Udit. Closing thought from Alejandra.
Yes, thank you. And also building a little bit on the questions that we heard before, I didn't want to forget that also UNEP is a very relevant organization that should be involved as well in these discussions, particularly when it comes to chemicals, the Chemicals and Waste Cluster from UNEP, also the Nairobi office that manages plastics, UNIA. There are several other international organizations that are very relevant at these discussions. So from my point of view, as a former regulator and currently working with ICCA, I really stress the need for further dialogue, for sharing information, for sharing ideas, and for bringing those ideas to these spaces. There is an urgent need, as everybody said, of reform, of modernization, of including aspects of digital, for example, into these regulations, of best practices that come from other organizations. There's so much that can be done that from my point of view, I think that there is an urgent need for action, and especially from developing economies that sometimes need their voice to be raised. And that's something very unique that ICCA has, the representation of several economies, several sizes of companies, different countries. So I think that there is an important voice here that hopefully it is heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandra. Catherine, you're up.
Thanks, Ed. I think I'd like to pick up on a point that Alejandra just mentioned there about developing countries. And we understand that the agenda currently faced by the WTO and even the future agenda, as we're suggesting in some of our recommendations, is a daunting one in terms of how do you actually effectively participate in some of these discussions if you are from a small developing country government where there may be only a few people working on some of these issues. And here I'd just like to give a reassurance, if you like, that organizations like the ICCA, its members, and the industry as a whole really shouldn't be fed in this regard, but should be viewed as a resource to draw upon. And I think that that's really also what we're putting ourselves out there as today, is that bringing industry into these discussions, improving the public-private dialogue around these really important issues is going to be beneficial for all. We're not coming to the table with a particular agenda here necessarily that we want to force down anybody's throat, but we really have a solid set of proposals that we hope would be at least inspirational for many of the member states of the WTO who perhaps sometimes just don't have the time. And we acknowledge that, to sit down and think about the broader issues of reform and modernization. So I'd like to just put in that last plug for the effective stakeholder engagement recommendations that we have made here today. Thanks.
That was a great plug, Catherine. Thank you for making it, because I think we really do value the ability to work with the members of the WTO in a more inclusive way, so that we can offer our deep technical expertise in all the reform discussions going forward. So last but not least, Lisa, could you provide us with your concluding thoughts?
Thanks, Ed. And yes, and I'll build on that. We spent the time and effort to put together this paper because as a global industry, developed and developing, large and small companies, we believe in the WTO. We see the value. It's directly tied to our ability to be part of the global economy. And multilateral rules drive that level playing field that gives all of us the opportunity, not only to compete on a commercial level, but to really drive innovation, especially in the spaces that we've been talking about around sustainable development. We saw this as an opportunity to come together and get tangible, demonstrate our support for the WTO, but also tie that to areas of opportunity to grow. And we would encourage everybody, with thanks to the great audience that has participated with us today, this is an area of opportunity for all of us. There are a lot of challenges in the world these days, but the way they get solved is by coming together, creating really practical, pragmatic ideas, and then working to see them implemented. That's certainly our plan going forward, and we look forward to doing that in partnership with the WTO, our friends in capitals, our friends across industries, and certainly our friends across the entire global chemical industry. So thanks for participating.
And thank you, Lisa. And thanks to our audience members for spending time with us today. And again, Lisa put the link to the paper in the chat. Encourage you to review it and come back to us when you have questions and comments, because we really want to engage constructively this year, next year, and we'll see all of you again, hopefully at MC12 in December. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, everyone.
Merci à tous.